Justice Minister Mmamoloko Kubayi has been tasked with chairing the panel responsible for selecting South Africa's next National Director of Public Prosecutions. The appointment by President Cyril Ramaphosa follows the same process used for the current NDPP, Advocate Shamila Batohi, back in 2018. Dullah Omar Institute senior researcher Dr Jean Redpath joins us now for more. Good to have you, Doc, and thank you very much for your time. Well, the long-awaited panel tasked with finding the person who will replace Shamila Batohi as head of the NPA has now been set up. Let's talk firstly about that timing and the delay.
Yes, I think the concern is that whether the panel will be able to do its work before Advocate Batohi leaves at the end of January, and whether there will be sufficient time for a smooth transition. What we would have preferred as civil society is actually that the legislation was changed to provide for the panel rather than leaving it up to the president to design a panel, because there are some key differences between this panel and the panel that appointed Advocate Batohi, in particular the omission of the Law Society and the Bar Association.
So you are concerned about the composition of the panel. I believe the chairperson is the minister, the chairperson of the South African Human Rights Commission, the chairperson of the Commission for Gender Equality, the Auditor General of South Africa, a chairperson of the Public Service Commission, a representative from the Black Lawyers Association, as well as a representative from the National Association of Democratic Lawyers. Who else would you have wanted outside of that list?
So I'm just comparing this panel with the panel that was used by the president on the previous occasion, where he included the Law Society and the Bar Association. So it's intriguing that he has left those two out and left the representation of the legal profession to the National Association of Democratic Lawyers and the Black Lawyers Association. If we compare to the composition of panels in countries to the north of us, such as Kenya and Zambia, it's a much broader composition. And this panel seems very heavy with chairpersons of Chapter 9 institutions who have been appointed by the president in turn and who might be considered to be more amenable to a candidate that the minister as chair might prefer.
So you're fearing political interference. Are you saying the Bar Association and the Law Society would have added weight that otherwise would not easily be swayed by political power?
So I'm not saying interference. What I'm saying is that a panel that is less government appointed heavy would have inspired more confidence in the process. And it does raise questions when previously there was a panel with 5 or 6 representatives of the legal profession, and now there are only 2, and they are of 2 organizations with very close links to the African National Congress, in fact. And so it raises questions that a more diverse panel was not put together. And in particular, what we as civil society would have liked to have seen is people who would have experience in actual litigation, who can make judgment calls on whether this person is going to have the relevant skills to take on this unenviable task of being the National Director of Public Prosecutions.
Now, the statement from the President via Vincent Magwenya saying that the person would be chosen, that is the National Director of Public Prosecution, through a process that is open, transparent, and that reflects the importance of this vital position in our democracy. One, does the President really take this position in our democracy seriously, in your view? But also, the open and transparent process of the appointment of Shamila Batohi, did it give us any benefits as South Africans?
Well, most certainly the previous process did give us benefits. There were other potential candidates. In fact, 3 of them have now been removed from the prosecuting authority for corruption, and they were shortlisted and were interviewed, but they were not put forward to the president. The transparency is really important. It's a good step that the president has brought in. Previous presidents did not do any consultation. There was no transparency at all. And so this is having the transparent interview process is a step forward. I remind viewers that the transparency last time was forced on the president by litigation. So what we're seeing now is a more transparent process than previous presidents applied, which is very welcome. However, as civil society, we would prefer to have the process determined in law, in legislation, so that a president can't in future change the composition of a panel to have maybe people who are more amenable to a particular point of view. I'm not saying that that is the case currently, but what we see is a more transparent process, yes, which we are happy about, but we would prefer there to be a permanently stipulated transparent process in law so that this can also apply to future appointments.
Looking at the number of cases, right, that the NPA would have lost in court, others would have been struck off the roll, others would have been poorly investigated according to judgments that would have been issued. I don't want to go into more details, but I suppose you know that the kind of challenges that the NPA would have gone through. There are others who are saying, yes, we could argue stability with Shamila Batohi there through this process, but not necessarily effectiveness and the well-running of the NPA. What would be your view?
So my view is part of the problem is the legislative environment. There is no transparent process for the directors of public prosecutions who are far more directly responsible. I'm talking about the layer in the divisions, which equate broadly to the provinces. They are responsible for the day-to-day prosecutions that happen in their divisions. And it is at that level where there is concern. So we would also prefer there to be legislation in place governing that level. We know that Andrew Chauke of DPP in Gauteng, Advocate Batohi asked for his removal some years ago, and it took the president 2 years to respond to that request. And we've seen very poor results come out of Gauteng during his tenure. So the legislative environment in which Batohi had to act, if she wanted to hire additional skills in, the process was to be determined through a provision in the legislation called Section 38, which would require her to get the minister's approval as well as financial approval. So a very onerous process, which effectively meant that she was not free to hire specialist skills, which may have been necessary in particular cases which are particularly difficult. And so, as civil society recommended when the legislation was changed to bring in the investigating directorate as a permanent entity, we recommended a more comprehensive change to the legislation for the prosecuting authority. Had that happened, Advocate Batohi would have been much more able to do what was necessary. So yes, there is a lot of criticism, and some of it is justified, but she has brought stability, which we haven't seen in the NPA for some time. And many of the cases that have been initiated during her tenure have not come to fruition yet. That is not only the responsibility of the National Prosecuting Authority, that is also a reflection on how the courts are processing cases. Yeah. And there are a lot of shortcomings on that side as well. And so it's a complex picture. I think history will be able to have a more objective view, but I totally understand the frustration of the public, and what the public really needs to ask for is legislation which empowers the NPA to do a better job. Whoever is appointed now will be faced with the same constraints as Advocate Batohi, and these constraints are considerable.
Appreciate your time this afternoon. That's Dr. Jean Redpath, their senior researcher from the Dullah Omar Institute.